Good morning, everyone. My name is Michael Naidrich, and I am the COO of Amerivet Securities, and I'm pleased to be joined again by our head of rates, all things liquidity in the Fed, Managing Director, CFA, Gregory Faranello. Hey, Greg, how are you this morning?
Michael, good to see you.
Okay, feels like we had a little halftime in between with Jackson Hole and the last Fed. Can you briefly bring me back and give us and refresh us and the clients on some of the notes from the Jackson Hole Symposium?
Sure. Mike, thanks as always for having me to share this with our clients. So we did a Jackson Hole segment not too long ago, and the Fed announced their policy framework changes mainly around inflation and employment. We've been discussing now for some time how the Fed has been leaning on the inflation side of their mandate. If you look back to 2018, when the Fed was actually tightening into year end, and then we quickly turned around, we had a pause, a pivot, and the Fed was soon easing with an unemployment rate at 3.5%. And what we were saying back to clients then was that the Fed was clearly leaning on the inflation side of their mandate. The Fed Listens program is a program that the Fed initiated back in late 2018 when Chairman Powell took over the Fed and Vice Chair Clarida came onto the scene. And it's been an ongoing evolution in terms of looking at the Fed's framework, both around inflation, both around employment. The changes that we saw coming out of Jackson Hole, where the Fed moved from flexible inflation targeting around a 2% symmetric target to flexible inflation averaging. And in addition to that, not only changes on the inflation side, which were really largely expected, we had changes on the employment side as the Fed now looks to the unemployment rate, the traditional measures of how inflation and employment trade off with each other as a broad-based and inclusive goal, and now not only looking at deviations with employment, but looking at shortfalls. So the real shift in our view coming out of Jackson Hole was inflation changes largely expected, was the shift on the employment side.
Yeah, it's always very interesting. There seems to be a good amount of Fed speak, including the chairman himself. What's the sentiment and key themes heading into Wednesday?
So a lot of Fed speak coming out of Jackson Hole, including Powell himself right before the blackout period, really to be expected. Major changes coming out of the Fed with this policy review. Like I said, largely anticipated. I think market participants were unsure whether it would be Jackson Hole or at the meeting this week. So the Fed speak coming out of Jackson Hole, I would categorize in really three buckets: Clarida, Brainard, and really Powell himself. The vice chair has been very involved in this policy framework change. He talked about the neutral Fed funds rate, the R squared, right? And how that rate really over time since 2012 has been shifting lower. So the assessment by the committee right now is that real neutral funds rate is around a 0.5, 50 basis points. If you add in a 2% inflation target, you've got a nominal Fed funds rate around 2.5%. So the concern from the Fed is over time here, they're going to continue to buffer up against the zero lower bound. With regard to Fed Governor Brainard, she's been linking now the new policy framework changes with the Fed moving from a period of market stabilization to accommodation. And what we mean by that is the Fed has largely said the asset purchases to date have largely been about market stabilization with some of the dislocations that we saw in the Treasury market when the crisis first hit to a period of accommodation. Now we all know what we've seen from the Fed in terms of where interest rates right now includes accommodation, but that's a pretty key theme here as the market is looking for the Fed to do more. And it's the first Fed official to really link further asset purchases potentially from the Fed relative to policy. And then we've got Powell himself, who spoke right before the blackout period. And he said, look, we're going to be measuring this in years. So very, very powerful statement. We'll get more clarity from the Fed this week in terms of what that means heading out in terms of years. But the Fed is obviously playing the long game here.
Yeah, so Greg, you and I have been doing this a long time together, and one of the nice things is we get a little continuity. And one thing that you've really taught me, and I know you really hone in on, is the presser that Chairman Powell will have on Wednesday. What are some of the key themes that you expect that he'll be confronted with, and what's the key piece of data that the market will be honing in on heading into that meeting?
Sure. So key piece of data, summary of economic projections. It's a quarterly really assessment from the committee members in terms of where they see the economy, in terms of GDP, in terms of unemployment, in terms of inflation, and then where they see the funds rate. Why that's important this time around is because we have the new policy framework in place. And I would say over time, if you look at the so-called dot plot, it's been decreasing in significance in a normal environment. But this will be the first time that the Fed puts out their summary of economic projections relative to the new framework. And it will also include 2023. So the market's going to watch that. With regard to the presser, the chairman, look, he's going to be questioned along the lines of what we're speaking about here. What does higher inflation mean? How much inflation are you willing to tolerate? We still expect the chairman to be very dovish. They're not going anywhere soon. Powell said that before the blackout period. The Fed is in this for the long haul. They're in this to help fight the pandemic and even through the pandemic. So we still expect a very dovish stance from the chairman, but he's going to be pressured more around specifics of the new policy framework, and then also about formal forward guidance, putting parameters, economic conditions around what would warrant the Fed moving off their zero interest rate policy. They've been reluctant to go there. The Fed speak has validated the fact that they feel like they've given enough informal forward guidance on a short-term basis. And I also see the chairman continuing to link economic evolution to the evolution of the virus. And at the same time, we see the chairman continuing to push back like they did at the last meeting to the fiscal side of the equation.
So, my favorite part of these sits downs is putting you on the spot. And, maybe it's the trader in both of us all these years. But, I want to ask you a question. With all the events in the last 6 months and in light of the Fed's recent framework changes, what's the biggest risk factor for the Fed and subsequently markets moving forward? No right or wrong answer here, Greg. Just your gut and intuition.
So that's a great question. I mean, I think the reality is inflation is the biggest wild card, not just really for the Fed, but for all global central banks. And we've had this environment over the last, call it 10 years, a lot of money supply, a lot of cash in the marketplace without any signs of inflation. So that is the real wild card. When you look at the factors in terms of the Fed pointing to different factors as to why the traditional trade-off between employment and inflation is not there, they talk about technology, they talk about productivity, they talk about globalization. And when you look at COVID, when you look at what's going on, we are literally deglobalizing by the day. You look at supply chains, you look at the supply side, it's becoming more costly. You look at the United States, you look at the potential to bring factories and jobs back into the United States. I mean, this goes counter to really what we've seen with the globalization effort of the last 25 years. You and I have talked about M&A recently, right? You see more pricing power. The bigger companies are getting bigger in COVID. That lends itself to more pricing power. So how do we see inflation? Ultimately, the demand side of the equation is really the big caveat. That involves the consumer. It clearly involves the job market. And I think what the Fed is saying here short term is they still see disinflationary forces in the marketplace. But should that turn around, should we do get disinflation now with the aid of fiscal money supply in conjunction with monetary money supply, forcing the Fed's hand at some point down the road, that is the big wild card, that the Fed actually gets what they're asking for.
Yeah, we were talking yesterday as a team, we're honing in here down the last 50 days coming into the election. It's going to be very interesting to see, how this all shakes out. Greg, just want to thank you again for your time. I know our clients, when you and I were on a call yesterday, one of our clients loves speaking to you and your insights. We'll be paying attention tomorrow, and I'm sure you'll be filling us in. So if any of our clients would like to speak to Greg, please reach out to your client representative. And as always, continued safety for everyone. Thanks, Greg. Great speaking to you, pal.
Thanks, Mike.